Welcome to our deep dive today. We'll be exploring the complex legacy of integration in America, focusing on its impact on education. We're joined by a leading scholar in social dynamics, racial equality, and education systems.
Glad to be here.
So let's jump right in. Could you give us a picture of the core benefits integration brought, especially for Black Americans in the South?
Before integration, educational opportunities for Black Americans in the South were severely restricted. Imagine segregated schools that were often underfunded, lacking essential resources, creating huge disparities in the quality of education.
And how did integration change that?
Integration, especially in education, brought a significant shift. We observed a 15% increase in high school completion rates for Black children who attended integrated schools from the first grade. And it wasn't just education, we also saw an improvement in income levels. For Black adults who had experienced integrated schooling, their average annual income went up from around $35,000 to $45,000, a 30% increase.
Those are some pretty impressive gains. Did these changes come at a cost to white Southern students?
That's a critical question. One key finding was that there was no negative impact on the education or income of white Southern students. This suggests that integration, at least in the South, wasn't a zero-sum game.
That's important to consider. However, I know you've also talked about integration facing complexities and criticism. Can you shed some light on those complexities even with these positive outcomes?
Absolutely. While the benefits were substantial, especially in the South, it's essential to understand that integration didn't have a uniform impact across the nation. For example, in the North, the effects were much weaker.
Why was that?
Issues like white flight and de facto segregation in the North limited integration's effectiveness. This uneven implementation adds another layer to the story. Another complexity was the burden placed on Black communities to navigate the integration process, which wasn't always smooth or equitable.
I see. So there were some unintended consequences.
Exactly. And sometimes the emphasis on integration as the primary solution for improving Black lives led to the unfortunate closure of some historically Black schools and the displacement of Black educators.
That must have been disruptive to those communities.
Absolutely. It disrupted crucial support systems within those communities. Also, framing integration as the sole solution might unintentionally stigmatize Black communities and spaces while upholding the dominance of whiteness.
You mentioned white flight earlier. Could you explain how that impacted integration efforts, particularly in northern schools?
White flight, the large-scale movement of white families from racially diverse urban areas to more homogeneous suburbs, was often a response to desegregation policies.
Did this have a measurable impact?
Yes, research indicates that school districts implementing desegregation plans lost twice as many white students compared to those without such plans.
And that must further hamper the integration efforts, right?
Exactly. This exodus of white students undermined the whole purpose of integration by concentrating minority students in urban districts, while white students moved to largely white suburban or private schools.
That shift in demographics must have had a significant impact on the resources available to different school districts, right? Did white flight worsen existing funding inequalities between schools?
Yes, unfortunately. As white families moved to the suburbs, they took their tax contributions and political influence with them. This often meant that non-white school districts ended up with significantly less funding per student.
How big was the difference?
On average, non-white districts received $2,226 less per student compared to predominantly white districts.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Yes, and this funding gap directly affected the quality of education and resources available, deepening the existing inequalities.
So even with the goal of creating more equitable opportunities, white flight actually widened the gap, impacting future generations. You mentioned earlier that Black families bore a disproportionate burden during this period. Can you expand on that?
During integration, Black families often faced a greater share of logistical challenges, especially when it came to busing.
Buzzing was a significant part of many integration plans, wasn't it?
It was. The idea was to transport students to achieve a better racial balance in schools.
Right, but it sounds like it wasn't always equitable.
Exactly. The burden of those long bus rides and the adjustments to schedules often fell disproportionately on Black communities. This added another layer of difficulty, and sometimes it even fueled resentment, as white families often had more options to avoid these challenges.
It's fascinating how a well-intentioned policy can have such complex and unintended consequences. Now, I'd like to shift our conversation to the concept of inclusion and its relationship to what you call white supremacy culture, particularly in the context of DEI initiatives. Could you define white supremacy culture for our listeners and explain how it impacts inclusion efforts?
White supremacy culture essentially refers to the pervasive belief that white people, their ways of thinking, and their ways of doing things are superior to those of people of color.
And how does this manifest in everyday life?
It's a system of beliefs and practices that often operates subtly and unconsciously, even in environments that appear progressive. Take perfectionism, for example.
That doesn't sound inherently bad.
It might not, but in a work or educational setting, this constant striving for flawlessness creates an environment where people of color who are already facing systemic barriers often feel pressured to prove themselves constantly. They are held to unrealistically high standards.
I see how that can be a problem. Are there any other examples of how this white supremacy culture might show up and hinder inclusion?
Another example is the emphasis on individualism. White supremacy culture tends to downplay the importance of collective action and shared responsibility. This can lead to a very competitive environment where individuals are pitted against each other instead of working together.
How does that hinder inclusion?
Well, it can make it harder for people of color to advocate for their needs or challenge the existing power structures. They might be perceived as troublemakers or not being team players.
Those are subtle yet powerful examples of how seemingly neutral cultural norms can actually contribute to exclusion.
Yes, and they prevent organizations and institutions from fully benefiting from the diverse perspectives and talents that people of color bring to the table.
You've highlighted the need to actively dismantle this white supremacy culture if we want true inclusion to take root. What are some key actions that individuals and institutions can take to achieve this?
First, white individuals need to acknowledge their privilege and how it contributes to maintaining exclusionary systems. This requires self-reflection, education, and a willingness to listen to and learn from people of color.
So it's about being aware of those systemic advantages.
Precisely. Second, we need to address unconscious biases head-on. These biases, often stemming from societal conditioning, can significantly influence decision-making and perpetuate those inequities we've been talking about.
And how do we address these biases?
Training and awareness programs can help individuals identify and challenge their own biases.
So it's not enough to just be not racist, but to actively work towards a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. There needs to be a shift from passive non-racism to actively working to dismantle racist practices and speaking out against injustice.
What about at the institutional level?
Institutions need to decenter whiteness in their DEI efforts.
What does that mean, practically?
It means shifting the focus from just integrating people of color into existing structures to fundamentally challenging and transforming those structures to be truly inclusive.
So it's about changing the system, not just adding diversity to the existing one.
Exactly. It also requires amplifying the voices of marginalized groups, ensuring they're part of decision-making processes. Lastly, dismantling white supremacy culture requires a holistic approach that goes beyond just intellectual understanding. It requires emotional and even bodily awareness. It's about unlearning deeply ingrained patterns of behavior and thought and challenging the systems of privilege that perpetuate inequity.
That's a really insightful way to put it. You've painted a clear picture of how deeply embedded white supremacy culture is in our institutions and daily interactions. In your research, you've also delved into how power and privilege disparities contribute to individual racial biases. Could you break down the mechanisms at play here and how these disparities show up in real-world scenarios?
One of the key mechanisms is how societal structures and representation shape our perceptions and biases. Think about the images we're exposed to in the media, the individuals in positions of authority, and the narratives we're told about different racial groups.
You're saying these representations influence our understanding of the world.
Yes. And in a society like the United States, white people are disproportionately represented in positions of power and influence, from politics and business to media and education.
So from a young age, individuals are exposed to this skewed representation of power and success, which can subconsciously reinforce biases.
Precisely. It can lead to the internalization of inequality. If children grow up in environments where doctors, lawyers, CEOs, and politicians are predominantly white, they might unconsciously internalize the idea that certain roles are inherently associated with whiteness.
And that can lead to feelings of otherness for people of color.
Absolutely. It contributes to the belief that they are somehow less capable or deserving.
This highlights the importance of early education and diverse role models.
Yes, and critical engagement with these societal structures and the historical context of how these power imbalances came to be. Without those, individuals might unknowingly absorb and perpetuate these biases.
Let's go a little deeper into how systemic inequalities beyond representation reinforce individual biases. What are some ways this happens in everyday situations?
Systemic inequalities reinforce biases subtly and are often overlooked. One example is the benefit of the doubt often extend to white individuals.
Can you give an example of that?
This plays out in countless situations, from minor transgressions to major life decisions. There was a study done in Australia, for instance, that found a staggering 72% of white people were allowed to stay on a bus without paying, compared to only 36% of black people.
That's a really stark example of how even seemingly objective situations can be swayed by unconscious bias.
It's not just about blatant discrimination. It's about those subtle ways in which privilege operates, benefiting certain groups while disadvantaging others. White privilege also grants unearned access to resources and opportunities that are often invisible to those who possess them. This can be anything from access to quality education and healthcare to opportunities for career advancement and wealth accumulation.
It sounds like you're saying these seemingly small advantages build up over time, leading to significant disparities in life outcomes.
Exactly. And the concentration of power among white individuals further perpetuates this cycle. This influences the production and promotion of cultural norms and products. Think about the media we consume, the products we buy. These often reflect and perpetuate existing biases, reinforcing the dominant narratives and shaping societal perceptions.
It creates a feedback loop.
Exactly. Biases are constantly reinforced, making it harder to challenge the status quo and achieve true equity.
So how do power disparities affect unconscious bias, especially in settings like schools, where decisions are often made quickly with limited information?
Think about how disciplinary actions are handled. Educators working within a system shaped by power imbalances might unconsciously make decisions influenced by their limited exposure to or understanding of ethnic minority students.
And that can lead to unfair treatment.
Absolutely. This can result in disproportionate disciplinary outcomes, with students of color facing harsher punishments for similar actions compared to their white peers.
This highlights the need for ongoing training and awareness to create a more equitable learning environment for all students.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier that the power of normal and the benefit of the doubt associated with white privilege actually contribute to recreating inequality. Could you explain what you mean by the power of normal and how it fuels systemic racism?
The power of normal refers to how whiteness often becomes the default, the standard against which everything else is judged. It's the unspoken assumption that white people are normal, while people of color are somehow different or other.
And this seemingly harmless assumption has significant implications, right?
Right. It can lead to the exclusion of people of color from positions of power, their experiences and perspectives becoming invisible, and the perpetuation of stereotypes and biases.
It's a subtle yet powerful example of how systemic racism works.
Exactly.
Can you give us a real-world example of this power of normal?
Sure. Think about how we talk about race. People often say things like, "I don't see color," or "we're all just human beings." While these statements might be well-intentioned, they actually erase the experiences and identities of people of color.
It seems counterintuitive, but you're saying that trying to be colorblind actually reinforces the problem.
Exactly. It reinforces the idea that whiteness is the norm and that race is something only people of color possess.
That's a crucial point. It's about acknowledging and addressing how race continues to shape our experiences and opportunities.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that colorblindness isn't a solution to racism. It's about acknowledging and addressing how race continues to shape our experiences and the opportunities that we have.
Let's shift our focus now to the impact of white flight on integration efforts. You mentioned it had both short-term and long-term effects. Could you elaborate on those, particularly as they played out in northern schools?
In the short term, white flight resulted in a dramatic decrease in the enrollment of white students in those districts undergoing desegregation. Some research suggests that the most striking negative impacts, things like steep enrollment declines, happened right away in those initial years following integration plans being put into place.
And the long-term effects.
The long-term effects were probably even more impactful. White flight ultimately ended up contributing to lasting changes in school demographics, with minority students concentrated in urban districts, white students in suburban districts.
So even while those integration efforts may have led to some desegregation within specific districts, they actually triggered changes in segregation patterns that we still see today.
Exactly, and the segregation between districts made it much harder to achieve meaningful integration on a larger scale.
What are some of the consequences, those lasting consequences of this demographic shift that we see today?
That legacy of white flight is still impacting educational opportunities and access for students today. Those predominantly minority districts often struggle with limited resources, they have less experienced teachers, and they see lower academic achievement
It
rates.
creates this kind of vicious cycle.
It does. Students from those disadvantaged backgrounds are often denied access to the same opportunities as their wealthier peers, which just perpetuates the cycle of inequality.
It really is a reminder that the pursuit of social justice requires constant attention and a willingness to adapt to those changing circumstances. Now, let's turn our attention to the topic of inclusion, and especially how it intersects with dismantling white supremacy, a topic that's really sparked debate in recent years.
The concept of inclusion has become very intertwined with the idea of dismantling white supremacy, especially when we think about those DEI initiatives.
DEI, for our listeners, is diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right. And this connection really stems from a growing recognition that the traditional ways we've approached inclusion just don't address the deeply rooted systemic nature of racism and how white supremacy culture influences so many of our institutions. It goes beyond simply adding diverse faces to structures that are already there.
So it's about more than just representation.
It is. It's about really challenging the systems that are perpetuating inequality and that are creating barriers to true belonging.
This idea, this connection between inclusion and dismantling white supremacy, has faced some pushback. Can you talk about why that is?
Explicitly linking inclusion to the dismantling of white supremacy has been met with resistance, particularly from those who benefit from the power structures that are already in place.
Because it challenges the status quo.
It does. And in some states, we've seen laws passed that actually ban DEI programs in schools and companies, often driven by fear that these programs promote division.
So there's a fear that talking about these issues will actually create more division rather than addressing the existing inequalities.
Right. They see DEI efforts as divisive, counterproductive, and they often overlook or minimize those systemic inequalities that these types of interventions are trying to address.
It seems like the simple act of naming and challenging white supremacy really triggers a defensive reaction from those who, whether consciously or not, are upholding these systems.
It does. And this pushback really underscores how deeply ingrained those power structures are, and that there's a real reluctance to let go of privilege.
So how do we move forward? How do we create truly inclusive environments, especially given these challenges?
To create genuinely inclusive spaces, we need a commitment to ongoing engagement and real systemic change.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, it includes things like building communities dedicated to anti-racist work, creating those spaces for sustained learning and action. Another key step is to implement policies and programs that actively promote equity and that challenge the existing power structures.
So we need to move beyond just individual level interventions.
We do. We need to shift our focus to systemic change.
What are some examples of policies and programs that can help to achieve this?
Sure. One example would be implementing hiring practices that are actually equitable. Remove the barriers for candidates of color and ensure that hiring committees themselves are diverse. Another important step is to provide training on unconscious bias and on cultural competency for all staff and leadership. Institutions can also make investments in those programs that specifically support the career advancement and the leadership development of people of color.
Those are concrete, actionable steps. Now let's shift gears and talk about your personal experiences, both as an activist and a scholar. I know you've been involved in various movements, including advocacy for Palestinian rights, which I believe led to your probationary status at Princeton University. What motivated you to take such a public stand, given the risks to your own career?
My commitment to social justice, it goes beyond just the academic research, the writing. I truly believe in aligning my actions with my beliefs. I want to use whatever platform I have to amplify the voices of those who are marginalized and to challenge injustice wherever I see it.
That takes a lot of courage. You've also spoken about your experiences as a Black scholar navigating those predominantly white institutions. I'm thinking of a story you've shared about being a graduate student and being recruited for this scientific program that needed to gain the trust of a Black community for some kind of experimental treatment. Can you talk more about that experience and the ethical dilemmas that you faced?
That experience was a really stark reminder of how complex it is to be a blackface in a predominantly white institution.
Blackface, what do you mean by that?
Well, I was brought in to help build trust with the Black community for this new treatment, but I quickly realized that my role, it was both tokenizing and really precarious.
Tokenizing and precarious. Could you unpack those terms for us?
Sure. I was used as the symbol of diversity and inclusion, but my actual voice, my concerns, were often ignored or dismissed. I was there to make the program look legitimate to the Black community, but I had very little power to influence how it was designed or how it was implemented. It felt like my identity was being exploited for the institution's benefit, but my expertise, my actual insights, weren't really valued.
That's a really striking example of how diversity without actual inclusion can be both exploitative and ineffective.
It is.
You've also spoken about witnessing these same types of dynamics play out at your own institution, where Black administrators were tasked with carrying out the university's efforts to actually suppress student protests. Could you tell us more about this and what the implications are?
That was incredibly troubling to me because it highlighted how individuals from marginalized groups can be used to protect institutions from criticism, allowing those power structures to remain unchallenged.
Could you provide some more context about what happened and how those Black administrators were involved?
Students were protesting against genocide, and the university, instead of engaging with their concerns, chose to shut those protests down. Black administrators were then put in the position of enforcing the university's policies, silencing and disciplining those students who were speaking out against injustice.
It's a powerful example of how performative inclusion can be used to mask practices that are actually oppressive.
Right. It makes you question the ethics of representation.
It makes you think about who these institutions are really serving.
And it shows how important it is to see past those superficial displays of inclusion to recognize how they can be used to keep those power structures in place.
It's about being critical and discerning.
It is. It's about understanding that simply having a seat at the table isn't enough if your voice isn't truly heard and your concerns are dismissed.
It's about having real power, not just the appearance of power. Now, let's move on to your perspectives on alternative educational models, which I know have been influenced by your own experiences being expelled from primary school. Can you talk about the insights you've gained from those experiences and the types of models that you think might better accommodate diverse learners?
Being expelled, along with my research, has really made me question the dominant approach to education, the one that values order and conformity over things like play and imagination. It tends to overlook the different ways that people are intelligent.
And you mentioned before that this kind of system actually ends up stifling creativity and individuality.
It does. It labels students who don't conform as problems, and it fails to recognize the unique strengths and those different learning styles that each student brings to the classroom.
What kind of alternative models do you think would address those problems, and how would they accommodate those diverse learners?
Well, there are schools and communities that are experimenting with approaches that focus on understanding why behavioral issues arise, getting to the root of the problem. They're finding alternatives to those practices that exclude students, like suspension and expulsion.
So it's about creating a more supportive environment.
It is, and there are different approaches to this. Some schools are using project-based learning, engaging students in real-world problem solving, encouraging them to work together and be creative.
That sounds much more engaging.
It is. Some schools are incorporating mindfulness and what's called social-emotional learning, helping students develop their self-awareness and their resilience. There's even experimentation with what's called democratic schooling,
Democratic schooling.
where students actually have a voice in shaping their own educational experience.
That's fascinating. Are there any particular examples or case studies that stand out to you as being particularly promising?
One example that comes to mind is the educational system in Finland. It really stands out. They prioritize play and that holistic development in early childhood.
That's so different from the more traditional rigid approach.
It is. They understand that play and that holistic development. They're critical for creating a love of learning and for raising well-rounded people, and it shows in their outcomes. They have impressive academic achievements, and the overall well-being of their students is very high. It proves that these alternative approaches can be effective.
It really challenges that assumption that academic rigor and that kind of holistic development are at odds with each other. Now, changing gears a bit, let's talk about universities and their role in fostering open dialogue. You've spoken before about how universities sometimes don't live up to their promise as places where challenging conversations can happen, particularly on controversial topics. What are your thoughts on this?
Ideally, universities should be spaces where all kinds of viewpoints, even those that challenge conventional thinking or make us uncomfortable, can be discussed openly.
They should be these marketplaces of ideas.
Exactly. But the reality often falls short of that ideal.
Why do you think that is?
Well, the current climate, it's characterized by so much polarization and sensitivity. It's really led to these calls for more control over what people can say on campuses.
There's a real tension there between trying to create inclusive and respectful environments while also making sure that those difficult conversations can happen. How do you navigate that?
It is a very delicate balance. I strongly believe in creating spaces that are inclusive and respectful, but I also believe that if we suppress certain viewpoints, even those we may disagree with, we can actually undermine intellectual freedom and that ability to think critically.
You've mentioned before that the way we idealize universities as these bastions of free speech, of intellectual exploration, often overlooks their historical and economic realities. What do you mean by that?
I think we forget that a lot of universities have these deep ties to the military-industrial complex, and they're often driven by profits. This influences the type of research that they'll support, the viewpoints that they're willing to tolerate.
So despite their claims to being places where you can freely pursue knowledge, they are actually influenced by power dynamics.
They are, and it's interesting, isn't it, how that resistance to open discussion often centers on the very topics that threaten those existing power structures or their financial interests.
Like what?
Well, the Israel-Palestine conflict is a perfect example. Universities, especially those with strong financial ties to particular industries or political groups, may be really hesitant to host events or give platforms to speakers who could put those relationships at risk or create bad press.
That makes sense. So the idea of the university as this neutral space for open inquiry clashes with the reality of power and money. Now let's talk about artificial intelligence, AI, which is rapidly changing the world. You've done extensive work on this, particularly with your concept of the new Jim code. Can you explain what that is and how it relates to the potential for AI to perpetuate those biases we've been talking about?
The new Jim code refers to the way algorithms and those AI systems can actually perpetuate and even amplify those existing racial biases and inequalities. It gets its name from the Jim Crow laws.
Which, for our listeners, were laws that enforced racial segregation.
Right, but instead of having those explicit laws, we now have these encoded biases that are embedded in technology.
Can you give us some concrete examples of how those encoded biases might show up in AI systems?
Sure. We've seen facial recognition systems that are trained on data sets primarily featuring white faces, and they've been shown to be less accurate when it comes to identifying people of color.
Which could lead to misidentification by law enforcement.
Exactly, and that could have very real consequences. We've also seen hiring algorithms that are trained on historical data reflecting gender and racial biases in hiring practices.
So the algorithms are actually learning from biased data, which perpetuates the problem.
Exactly. And then there are predictive policing tools.
Which are?
Tools used to try to predict where crimes are going to happen. These often end up reinforcing existing patterns of racial profiling.
Because they're trained on data that already reflects those biases.
Right. And these are just a few examples of how the new Jim Code operates in subtle ways, but with powerful consequences. Systemic inequalities are being perpetuated through technology.
That's a sobering thought. Even with all the promise of technological advancement, we're at risk of replicating and even amplifying existing social injustices if we're not careful. You've urged people to be cautious about embracing AI wholeheartedly, especially in education, emphasizing that we need to cultivate other forms of intelligence along with it. What do you mean by that?
AI definitely has the potential to change education for the better, but we can't rely on it as this quick fix or replacement for human interaction and critical thinking. Those AI systems, they're only as good as the data they're trained on.
So if the data reflects our existing biases, the AI will simply perpetuate them.
Exactly. Instead of focusing all our energy on AI, we should prioritize nurturing other forms of intelligence, like what I call ancestral intelligence.
Ancestral intelligence, what's that?
It encompasses that collective wisdom, the knowledge that's been passed down, especially within those communities that have been marginalized. This kind of intelligence has valuable insights into navigating systems of oppression, how to build resilience, how to foster community.
It's about recognizing that there are different ways of knowing, and that those ways of knowing are valuable.
Exactly. And we also need to cultivate what I call abundant imagination.
Abundant imagination, what is that?
It's that ability to imagine other futures, to think outside the box, to challenge those narratives that we're told are set in stone. In this age where data and algorithms are becoming more and more dominant, we have to nurture that capacity to imagine. We have to resist just accepting the solutions we're presented with and engage our imaginations to shape a future that works for all of us.
So it's about reclaiming our agency in the face of all this technological advancement. It's about remembering that technology should serve us, we shouldn't be serving it. You've also talked about the human labor that goes into those AI systems that seems so effortless. Could you shine a light on that often invisible aspect of the AI industry?
We tend to see the sleek interfaces of AI, those impressive capabilities, but we often overlook the huge amount of human labor that makes it all possible. Behind all those algorithms and those user-friendly apps, there are real people, often working in low-wage countries.
What kind of work are they doing?
They're doing things like data cleaning, content moderation, training AI. These workers are often subject to exploitative conditions, low pay, and they can suffer real psychological trauma from the work that they do.
Can you give some specific examples of the kinds of tasks these workers are doing?
Sure. Think of those content moderators. They have to sift through all those social media posts, videos, images. They're identifying and removing content that violates policies, which can include incredibly graphic and disturbing content.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is. It takes a toll. Then there are the data cleaners who are responsible for cleaning and labeling all that data that's used to train AI algorithms. And the AI trainers who are teaching those algorithms how to do specific tasks by feeding them all that data and correcting their mistakes. These are really demanding jobs.
It's a reminder that all this technological progress often comes at a human cost.
It does. And we need to address these ethical concerns. Companies need to implement fair labor practices, provide living wages and benefits, and support their workers' mental health. Governments need to step up, create regulations that protect these workers' rights, make sure they have safe working conditions, and hold those companies accountable for any exploitation.
It's about recognizing that human dignity and well-being shouldn't be sacrificed for the sake of technological progress.
Exactly.
You've also raised concerns about the environmental costs of AI. Can you talk about how those factor into this conversation about responsible AI development?
AI has a significant environmental impact, and people don't talk about it enough. Training complex algorithms takes a lot of computing power, which uses a lot of energy, and that contributes to carbon emissions.
So data centers, those places that house all those servers, they're consuming huge amounts of energy.
They are, and water, too, which contributes to climate change and resource depletion.
So the costs of AI go beyond those related to labor exploitation.
Yeah,
It's also affecting the planet.
it is.
What can we do to minimize those environmental costs?
Well, we have to develop algorithms and hardware that are more energy efficient. We should invest in renewable energy to power those data centers. We need to think about the entire life cycle of these AI systems, from where those raw materials come from to how we dispose of that electronic waste.
It's about thinking more holistically.
It is. Sustainability needs to be a core principle.
Now, I do want to acknowledge that AI also has the potential for positive applications, especially in areas like healthcare.
It does.
Can you share some examples of how AI could be used responsibly in those areas?
In healthcare, AI is already being used to analyze medical images for early disease detection, to develop more personalized treatment plans, and to speed up the drug discovery process.
That sounds very promising.
It is, but we can't just assume that AI will automatically lead to equitable outcomes.
So even with good intentions, things could go wrong.
They can. Think of those algorithms in healthcare that determine who receives certain treatments or medications. If they're trained on data that reflects those historical disparities in access to healthcare, those algorithms could perpetuate those same disparities, denying certain populations the care they need.
That makes sense.
And in education, we need to be careful with AI systems that track student behavior. Those could end up reinforcing existing biases. For example, if an algorithm is trained on data showing that certain demographics tend to have lower academic performance, it could unfairly flag students from those groups as being high risk.
And then those students could be denied opportunities. So it's not just about the technology itself, but about how it's being used.
Exactly. We have to be really careful about the values that are guiding the development and implementation of this technology.
You've mentioned an example of healthcare AI system that was trained on data from patients' self-reported experiences of pain. And it turned out to be more accurate than systems that relied only on doctors' reports. What does that tell us about developing AI systems?
It shows how important it is to consider those diverse data sources, to include different perspectives when we're developing these systems. Traditional medical systems, they often prioritize objective measures and clinical observations. They may miss out on those subjective experiences.
The patient's voice isn't always heard.
Exactly. But by including the patient's narrative, the patient's perspective, these AI systems can become much more accurate. It's a good reminder that AI shouldn't replace human judgment or empathy. It should be a tool that can improve our understanding and our decision-making.
So it's about using AI to enhance human capabilities, not to replace them. I'm particularly interested in the idea of using AI to actually identify those systemic biases within institutions. What do you think about that approach?
I think it has a lot of potential. Analyzing things like judges' sentencing patterns that could reveal unconscious biases that contribute to disparities in our justice system. We could also use AI to look at hiring practices, school disciplinary records to pinpoint and mitigate those discriminatory patterns.
So instead of focusing on labeling individuals, we can actually use this data to identify the systems and the people in positions of power who are creating those harmful environments.
Exactly. It's about looking at the bigger picture, the systemic issues. We need to be creative in using this data to challenge the status quo. It's about recognizing that AI is not just a technical challenge, but a moral one that requires careful deliberation and collective action.
You've spoken about the importance of having diverse stakeholders involved in the design and testing of AI systems. Can you elaborate on why diversity is so crucial in this context and how it helps to mitigate bias and promote fairness?
Diversity is crucial because it helps to ensure that these systems are fair, representative, and responsive to the needs of all populations. When AI systems are developed by teams that lack diversity, they're more likely to reflect the biases and blind spots of those teams.
So you're saying that a lack of diversity in the development process can actually lead to biased AI
Mhm.
systems.
Exactly. Involving individuals from diverse backgrounds with different perspectives, experiences, and values can help to identify and mitigate potential biases, leading to more equitable and inclusive AI systems.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's about ensuring that the people designing these systems reflect the diversity of the society they're meant to serve. You've also emphasized the importance of creating mechanisms for accountability and redress when AI systems cause harm. Could you elaborate on what those mechanisms might entail and how they can help to ensure that individuals are protected from the potential negative consequences of AI?
These mechanisms could include things like independent audits of AI systems to assess their fairness and accuracy. We need clear guidelines for data privacy and security, and we need avenues for individuals to challenge AI decisions that they believe are unfair or discriminatory.
So it's about having checks and balances in place to ensure that AI systems are being used responsibly and that individuals have recourse if they've been harmed. What role does the legal system play in all of this?
It's also crucial to establish legal frameworks that hold developers and deployers of AI systems accountable for the consequences of their actions. AI is not above the law.
You're right. We need to ensure that there are consequences for those who develop or deploy AI systems that cause harm. You've spoken about the importance of public education, about the potential implications of AI. Could you elaborate on why public awareness is so important and how we can foster a more informed and engaged citizenry in the age of AI?
Public education is crucial for creating an informed citizenry that can participate in shaping how this technology is developed and used. We need to educate people about the potential benefits and risks of AI, the ethical concerns, and how it's already impacting their lives.
This is a complex topic. How can we make this information accessible to the general public?
Think public forums, educational workshops, media campaigns, and online resources. We need to empower people to critically evaluate AI systems and advocate for policies that promote responsible AI development.
We've covered so much in this deep dive, from the history of integration to the complexities of AI. Your insights have been incredibly valuable. In closing, I want to ask you a broader question about hope. In the face of all these challenges, from systemic racism to the potential pitfalls of AI, what gives you hope for the future?
What gives me hope is the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit. Throughout history, we faced what seemed like insurmountable challenges, and yet we found ways to overcome them. I believe we can harness the power of AI for good, to create a more just and equitable world.
I share that hope. It's about recognizing that we have the power to shape the future we want to see.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us today. It's been a truly enlightening conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.